Everyone in the small town of Ringgold, Georgia, knew Alvin Ridley. The former TV repairman was something of a local boogeyman. He rarely left his house, and when he did, he was always by himself. So when Ridley called 911 to report the death of his wife, a woman that nobody had ever heard about, let alone seen, people were obviously shocked. Quickly, a narrative began to emerge. Alvin Ridley had held this woman captive for more than 30 years, and then he strangled her. It didn't take much for the citizens of Ringgold to believe it, and it wasn't long before police came to the same conclusion and charged Alvin with first-degree murder. But there was one person who would come to Alvin's defense. At first, it was just business, but eventually, a down-on-his-luck attorney named McCracken Poston would become Alvin's biggest defender and a friend. In his memoir, Zenith Man, Poston recounts his experience representing Alvin Ridley and tells the story of one of the strangest trials in Georgia history. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. So can we start by talking about Alvin? Take me back to 1997 when all this started.
Well, I need to take you back further because Alvin and my sister were high school classmates. You know, my sister told me over the years, that he was unusual. The first thing I remember about Alvin was that he was our TV repairman. My father was a notorious person who dealt with outsiders. To go on a shopping trip with my father, you would end up in a couple of flea markets and maybe a pawn shop. And Alvin just fit the bill for the type of person my dad often did business with.
So when it comes to his reputation in town, though, what was it that, you said he was odd. What does that mean? Like, why did he sort of get this reputation?
Well, Alvin was a mystery to most people. Alvin and Virginia Hickey married in 1966. They got their license from the Catoosa County Courthouse, and within months, her parents were putting articles in the local newspaper that said, "Parents seek married daughter," and said they are appealing to the people for help. They haven't seen their daughter for 3 years. So that was pretty much right after the wedding. And that rumor started getting out. A number of sheriff deputies had to get involved trying to locate Virginia. But here you had an article in the paper on the front page. So that deepened the mystery about Alvin. In 1984, he abruptly shut his business down. He would post missives on the inside of the glass facing out, blaming everybody for his business failure. And he began also suing everybody. So Alvin had a terrible reputation in town, and ultimately he sued enough people that somebody sued him back, claiming frivolous litigation. And they thought they got a judgment against Alvin, and they executed against a 1977 Chevy van that Alvin had. This became the apex of Alvin's conspiracy theories, the taking of his van.
Then now let's jump to 97. So he set that morning up for me, or that evening into the morning. Sort of what happens at home, and when do the police sort of get word of what happened in his house?
Well, he leaves his home, locks the homemade gate behind him. He drove almost out of town and then thought better of it and turned around and came back. He tried to call a hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a hospital that he had a history of trusting since that was the one he was born in. And he tried to get them to come get his wife who had stopped breathing. And they said, "Sir, that's not how it works. You've got to call the local authorities." And so reluctantly, he called 911, and they had a bit of a prosecutorial field day with the fact that he had a monotone, flat effect in his voice. And as they said, even in the trial, he doesn't seem to be emotional about his wife of 30 plus years dying. And so he was immediately suspected, but it actually took them a number of months before he was charged. But within 3 days of her death, he was kind of stalking me on the street. And so 3 days went by where we're meeting at the exact same intersection of street and sidewalk. And I began to realize this is by design. And so, I finally said, Mr. Ridley, I'm sorry for your loss. Because it was the buzz around town that there was a dead woman at Alvin's house. And who is she?
You mentioned some people did know they were married, but it really was 30 years and anybody saw Virginia. Do we know now why? Like, what was life like before he got out and called about her death? What was going on there?
Well, that was the mystery. Where has this woman been? Now, the mystery later revealed itself to me, but only after a long, frustrating 15 months. Alvin, again, kept looping back to the taking of this van, and he finally just stood his ground and insisted that I go and investigate all these civil cases, which were all dismissed. But I stumbled upon a case he hadn't mentioned, and that was a 1970 eviction from public housing. Well, guess who was in the courtroom? Virginia's parents. So this was an eviction where they were flushing out Virginia.
Ah, interesting.
Alvin's father brought Virginia into the courtroom. Virginia stood in front of the bench in the old Catoosa County Courthouse and said, when I married this man, he and I became one. I want to be left alone with my husband. And she was furious that her parents interfered. And so she basically swore off her own family. And as far as I could tell, never communicated with them again. Now, I do think that perhaps she had some developmental issues. She had epilepsy, and Alvin tried to get her to go out. She refused to go out, fearing that she would have an episode, a seizure. And so she became extremely reclusive.
So you start representing Alvin, and he's, shall I say, a challenging client?
I had a client who was hell-bent on kneecapping every defense angle I would present. And he was making it so difficult for me because all he wanted to talk about was this van that got taken in 1984. So at one point we were yelling at each other, which is how our early meetings always ended. And he said the word van, and I said, oh, Lord, the van. Well, he thought I was praying. And he immediately went quiet. His eyes were shut tight and his hands were clasped. And I looked at him and I thought, this is something I could work with. So I began to pray my legal advice to him, and he would get quiet and very reverent, and he would listen, at least act like he was listening, but he wasn't yelling. So we ended up praying pretty much every meeting from then on for the next 15 months.
Now, it doesn't sound to me like he's the kind of guy that you would think would kill his wife because, like you said, he was with her, he loved her. What was there? Was there any physical evidence? What was the reason why the police and then the prosecutors believed that he might have done that?
The state medical examiner focused on petechial hemorrhaging around her eyes and mouth. These are tiny ruptured blood vessels that can happen in an asphyxiation case, but they can also happen in a number of other ways. And of course, having a seizure, I thought, was a perfect explanation of why you would have them. But the state of Georgia took the position that She had so much of it, it was more than a seizure alone could create. So that's what the state was going on. But of course, it was bolstered by this terrible reputation. Now, I didn't think this was a guy who seemed like a killer, but Alvin would give a menacing stare to people. He was just so not understanding what people were coming at him about. And so he withdrew. He became somewhat frightening, actually, in his appearance, his demeanor. And of course, then the reputations of the boogeyman, and they just got worse and worse the older he got. So the tabloids had headlines like, "Sicko holds wife hostage for 30 years, then kills her." This was in every supermarket stand in America.
So, the deck is really stacked against Alvin, isn't it? But then you get kind of a lucky break, right? Can you tell me about that?
So we were headed toward a September 1998 trial, and the DA gave me a gift, 45 new witnesses, and I'm a sole practitioner. So there was no way I could get through those witnesses before trial. So because of that, I got a brief continuance for 3 months. And that was an incredible gift because a very tragic thing happened in September of 1998. The American Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner died.
At a news conference last Thursday, the Orange County Coroner's Office in California confirmed that Ms. Joyner's death involved a rare congenital blood vessel abnormality in her brain.
And so in October, the autopsy comes out, and Florence Griffith Joyner died of a seizure. But she also had petechial hemorrhages, multiple times worse than Virginia. So by the state of Georgia standards, if Virginia Ridley was murdered, then Flojo would have been brutally murdered, which we all know was not the case.
Did you start off having an idea that he was being railroaded and that you believed in his innocence, or did you have a sense one way or the other at the beginning of whether he was innocent or guilty?
Kathleen, less than 2 years before I began this case, my political career ended with a pretty humiliating loss for the United States Congress. And so I was wounded and hurt. And to me, it didn't matter if Alvin Ridley was guilty or not, because this town did not like him. And this town apparently didn't like me. So I was going to help the guy.
And the trial is complicated and long, and we can't go into it all here. That's what your book is about, and it's detailed and fascinating. But tell me a little bit about how the prosecution, which went on for a long time, presented the case. What were you faced with them?
Well, I think it's important to tell you that Alvin was so difficult with me, he would not let me in his house. And 14 months went by with me asking to get into his house because I want to show it's obvious from the outside of the house that there are no bars on the windows, which some of the media was saying there were. And so I was trying to convince him I need to get in. But he just blocked me at every point. On Thanksgiving Day of 1998, my parents prepared a couple of extra plates of Thanksgiving feast. And I thought, oh, great, I'm getting 2. But my parents said, we want you to take this one to Alvin Ridley. That's the last place I wanted to go on Thanksgiving. It just seemed to be that I was getting in the way of his cooperating with me. But the gesture of a nice plate of food on Thanksgiving Day turned Alvin. What I realized later was he was quite transactional. And I presented him with something delicious that smelled good coming out of the paper bag. Alvin immediately thought, well, I need to give him something. And then, of course, he knew I wanted to be in the house. And he said, come on in. My eyes are trying to adjust in this very difficult room. There are strange things like dolls that are attached to the wall. And I could tell from the coroner's photos that the house was a lot messier than it was the day Virginia died. And I could tell a lot of that was because Alvin was eating a lot of fast food and bringing it home, and there the bags were. Well, now he had a problem with vermin in the house, and I could tell that as well. But as my eyes were trying to focus in this really one light bulb room, and my shadow of my head was getting in the way of me trying to read a number of papers, hundreds of papers attached to the wall. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw just a bunch of mundane references, recipes, kind of a diary of sorts. And my heart jumped because I thought, this is in kind of a feminine hand. And I asked Alvin, I said, who wrote all this? And he said, well, Virginia did. And I got too excited, classic, because I said, Alvin, this is going to save you. And he said, you can't have it. That's all I've got left of her. So I grabbed his hands and started to pray because I wanted to convince him that we have to use these things. And we worked out a deal, again, very transactional Alvin, that for $200 I could copy them all because I had to give copies to the DA. And then we would argue later over the originals. But he did let me in the house for 4 days, which I can never undo in my life. But he led me to another room where there were 30 years of her writings. And, there were descriptions of the moon landings. She had a mild fangirl crush on the actor, director, producer, Ron Howard. And she wrote a lot about him. Just a wonderful diary. I estimate there's 15,000 plus entries. And I'm just speeding through it. A lot of it has to do with nothing. It's her favorite songs, her favorite TV shows. Interestingly enough, we used to have a TV show called Unsolved Mysteries. I don't know. Did you have that in Canada?
We did.
Tonight, the season premiere of Unsolved Mysteries.
Virginia wrote a pitch for Unsolved Mysteries. And it was about the taking of Alvin's van.
Of course it was.
And meanwhile, I also learned while I was on the property that the van had been returned 3 weeks later.
Oh, my gosh.
But Alvin refused to accept it. And now it had been sitting for 15 years unaccepted. So I just was so amazed and frustrated at the same time. But Alvin insisted on keeping the originals. So I tried to categorize them. I tried to put them in envelopes, but they stayed in 2 ancient suitcases that Alvin kept by his side all the time. But hitching a ride to the courtroom in those suitcases every day were scores of cockroaches. And about 3 days in, the judge got very frustrated and said, Mr. Poston, we're taking this trial to the other courthouse while I get my courtroom fumigated. Well, I realized going into the other courthouse, which is adjacent, that we are reuniting Virginia's writings with the last place she had ever been seen in public. September 15, 1970, the eviction trial. Because she had not been seen in public after that date. So I wanted to knock out that whole notion that she had been held against her will. Well, her writings ended that. One of her last writings was a notation of how much she loved Alvin and that the city had messed up their water line.
I mean, the trial is so full of twists and turns, and we can't go into it all. But at one of your last witnesses was not someone you expected to put on the stand.
I had decided early on, because I could not have a conversation with Alvin about Virginia, that he would get very emotional, and then he would blame whoever took his van for worrying his wife to death. So I was really getting frustrated with him. But because he kept looping back to this van. And so I just thought, if a juror sees him do that, they're going to think he's very cold and detached. And so I thought I had convinced him. Alvin, I don't think you should take the stand. But we had a bit of a disaster with another so-called expert witness that Alvin wanted to use. And during lunch, Jesus appeared only to Alvin and ordered Alvin to take the stand. Well, in Georgia, a constitutional issue like that was not my call to make. That was always Alvin's call, whether to testify or to not testify. But it turned out Alvin was incredible because I let him be Alvin. I let him tell his whole story, conspiracy and all. And he actually was quite charming on the stand. There were a lot of missteps because I didn't know this about Alvin, but I should have detected how literal he is. And a lot of your listeners are already guessing what the final mystery was that we didn't know for 22 years after the trial. Another podcaster reached out to Kimberly Clark Barnes, one of our jurors, because she was an integral juror. She was the newspaper reporter also that covered the case. But she told a podcaster that has been bothering me for over 20 years, ask Mr. Poston, does he think Alvin is autistic?
You know, you said you didn't know he was autistic, but the book really makes it clear, and in the writing and the way you speak about Alvin, is that over the course of the trial and getting to know him and trying to figure out what happened, you develop an affection for him. Did you ever think back to that? Like, tell me about sort of the evolution of your feelings for him, despite all sort of the dirtiness of Alvin and the problems with the cockroaches and that. There was a special friendship that it was very clear was developing.
I did not have it at first.
Yeah, that was
Alvin,
clear too.
We screamed at each other. As this 15-month odyssey played out, and everything in the book is true because I documented everything very well. And my conversations with Alvin were easy because we had the same damn conversation every time we talked. But even the eve of the trial, I just couldn't explain everything. I still had a nagging doubt because Alvin would not let me in his mother's room in the back of the house. And the eve of the trial, I was at his house just trying to prepare him. I brought him food so that he could be kind of in siege mentality and not get out and about in the community. And I just thought, I got to see what's in that room. I've heard things in there. My mind, with all of his reputation, went wild. Is there somebody else in there? Is there did they have a child and are they in a cage? And you know, just my stupid mind had a little doubt. I put my shoulder to the room. There was a flurry of smell and sight, and they were chickens. Alvin started crying because some of his chickens froze. We were having a very hard winter for Georgia. And so he invited the rest of them to come into the house, where he had to keep them locked away from his cats, Kitty and Meowie. And so I realized when I discovered Alvin's chicken rescue mission that this guy wouldn't hurt a fly.
Yeah.
And he just has that kind of heart. And then I just was plunged in despair of, can I do enough? Can I do enough for this guy? He's so difficult. So after he took the stand and did such a good job for himself, even, jurors were laughing at some points of our misunderstandings. And they were seeing me struggle and I guess enjoying it. I did feel an affection for Alvin. For one thing, he had saved me. I had lost this congressional race. I had gone through a divorce. I was just lost. Alvin gave me a cause, and we were still in the game. And so there was an immense, in court, there was an immense relief and release that I was feeling, that it's in God's hands now.
This is while the jury was deliberating.
While the jury was out. And so it just was an overwhelming feeling of brotherhood that I felt for Alvin now, because we were yoked now for the rest of our lives. And so it was very special to see him vindicated.
He was found not guilty.
That's correct. Now, of course, 22 years later, when I figure out, hey, maybe he has autism, I took him. It was important enough for me to know, because I had been trying to tell this story, but I was unsatisfied at the end of all of these tellings, because I really didn't feel that I could do Alvin justice. Because just saying, well, he's an eccentric guy, that's not doing Alvin justice. This was a guy now that I cared for. So the autism angle, that finally formed the book in my head. The looping back to the van, that is a autism trait. During the trial, he was constantly jingling change in his pocket, which I would grab his hand and tell him to stop. That was stimming, classic autism behavior. 22 years later, I apologized to Alvin. I said, Alvin, I didn't know. Please forgive me. I did not know about autism. I didn't know. And Alvin, what the diagnosis did for Alvin.
Yeah, I was going to ask, he knew. He must have known. Obviously, you told him. How did he respond to it?
It lifted him. He became much more relaxed in the community. Gone were the hard stares that he gave people, because people were suddenly being more warm to him. And so it was wonderful for everybody. And in my book, there is not a person who was acting with bad intent. There were a lot of us that were acting out of ignorance, but there was not anybody who was acting out of bad intent. Even the coroner, who everybody feels was Alvin's biggest tormentor, because they had had a personal interaction that we felt colored her view of him. Christmas a year ago, she asked me, does Alvin have anywhere to go for Christmas dinner? Well, I knew he's probably going to end up at my house. And so I said, no, he doesn't have a place to go. and so she invited him. And I told him, I said, Alvin, I think, this is a Christmas miracle. This was a woman who feared you and who testified against you. And now she's inviting you to break bread with her family. And Alvin, of course, wanted to go. And so I said, listen, Alvin, this is kind of a social skill I want to teach you. Only stay about 90 minutes, hour and a half tops. That's all you need to do, eat, because this is their family Christmas. So, of course, Alvin calls me from the side of the road, and Alvin's out of breath, and he said, "It's 90 minutes, I'm leaving." And he's, next call I get was from the former coroner, who says, "Where'd Alvin go? I'm fixing his dessert." And so I said, "I'm sorry." I told him 90 minutes. He took it very literally. She took his dessert to him at his house. And as lighter as Alvin was from the later part of 2021 until the book came out, there was nothing like, I could never have predicted Alvin at the book launch and thereafter. He became a superstar. And the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library hosted the book launch.
Wow.
And I invited Alvin to come up. And he completely took over the show. And he was relaxed, and he was just having the time of his life. And so Alvin, we had been monitoring a lack of or a loss of kidney function at the VA Medical Center over the last several years. I would take Alvin to the doctor. And he really started to decline. And so we went to the doctor to check him out. He ended up going to the hospital that day, and he never came home. But the doctor said, "Mr. Ridley, I heard about this book." And Alvin lit up, and there were tears in his eyes. And he said, "Doctor, we went to Jimmy Carter's place in Atlanta, and I spoke to 300,000 people." And the doctor looked at me, and I said, "Chop 3 zeros off the end of that." And Alvin said, "And they smiled at me, and they put their hands together for me, and they liked me." He was in the hospital for several weeks trying to get his strength back. And I get a call at 2:30 in the morning from a doctor who said, "Mr. Ridley is having a moderate heart attack. I need you to make a decision. If we go and help to address his heart, his kidneys will never work again." And I said, I don't care what Alvin told you. I can't make that decision. I'll be there in a minute. And so I went to Chattanooga and went to his bedside. Alvin's sitting up in the hospital bed. He's got his blazer on that he liked to wear over his hospital gown. He's handing out these book cards to the nurses that he hadn't met yet on third shift. And I thought, well, this is a wonderful opportunity. And I said, "Alvin, do you think Virginia and your mom and dad are calling for you to come home?" And he immediately said, "No, they want me to stay here with you." And it touched me deeply. And so, as I very often did with Alvin, I would pivot and change my approach. I said, "Alvin, I want you to know that I'm looking forward to meeting Virginia, because I feel like I know her better than anybody but you, anybody living, and really probably anybody in her family of the last half a century. And now that I'm going to heaven," Alvin was cool to talk about it. And he said, "My daddy will take us fishing up there. They've got a river where you can catch 30 fish an hour." So I learned about heaven has a catch limit on its river up there. Now, Alvin did talk to me about death a couple of years before, when he kind of groused that a cousin he hadn't heard from in years was suddenly reaching out. He said, "I think they're just waiting on me to die." And I said, "Alvin, you don't have to leave your worldly possessions to an individual. You can leave it to a cause." And Alvin went, and he made a will to leave his entire estate to a trust to go to autistic kids for a scholarship. And I'm very excited about that his name, and that was what excited Alvin, that his name will last years longer than he was here.
So when did Alvin finally die?
He died that day after our talk about heaven and the river where you can catch 30 fish an hour. He died 5 minutes after that conversation.
Wow.
And I am so thankful that I was there, because I've had friends who passed away alone in the hospital, and I would not have wanted that for Alvin.
Well, what a blessing he was for you, and you were for him.
Well, and Alvin gave me a second act with my career with the criminal law, and then maybe a third act with this book.
Yeah.
Which I've really enjoyed telling the story. And, my publishers wanted me to write about other cases, other stories, and, they may be there, but none are as special to me as this one.
Well, it was special to read, and it was really fun for us to read too. So thank you, and thanks for the time.
I'm sorry if I'm a difficult interviewee.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We release a new episode every Monday, so please remember to follow the show in your podcast app. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcasts' YouTube channel, or by subscribing to CBC Podcasts' True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our True Crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Mitchell Stewart. Sound design by Julian Uzielli and Mitchell Stewart. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner, our video producer is Evan Agard, and our YouTube producer is John Lee. Media sourced from L'Atelier des Archives and Unsolved Mysteries. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts.